The faint glow of the bedside lamp cast soft shadows across the room, painting everything in muted tones. Lauren woke up in the middle of the night to an eerie silence and a gory sense that something was off. Her eyes were still blurry from sleep, but she was startled wide awake by the distinct presence of someone standing at the foot of her bed. She blinked a few times to make sure she wasn't dreaming, but she saw a tall, thin figure standing motionless as if waiting for her to notice. "Is it Michael?" The figure took a step forward just enough for the dim light to illuminate a portion of her face. It wasn't Michael. Those eyes are cold blue and filled with an unsettling mix of confusion, and something darker made Lauren freeze in place. "Ethan," she called softly, her voice hoarse from the sudden interruption of her sleep. There was no response, just an uncomfortable silence that lasted too long. Her heartbeat quickened, and her hand instinctively gripped the edge of the blanket. Lauren sat up fast, her body stiff, her thoughts racing as every nerve in her body shouted at her to be cautious. "What are you doing here?" she gasped, half in amazement, half in terror. And he remained there, mute and still, staring at her. Ethan shifted uneasily, as if he was having trouble coming up with a response. "Why are you standing in my room in the middle of the night?" he said, his voice low and trembling, but something about the way he said it felt wrong. Lauren could sense it in the coldness of his words, in the way his gaze ducked from hers and then darted back. She stood, putting distance between them, her tone firm but measured. "Okay, Ethan, you entered my room without my permission when I was asleep. Do you realize how inappropriate this is?" Ethan just stood there staring at her, his expression unreadable, as if he was trying to figure out something about her that she couldn't understand. The air in the room became heavier and more oppressive with every second that passed, and Lauren's chest tightened as she tried to keep her composure. "Ethan, I need you to leave. Right now," she said. Her voice was sharper this time. This time he moved, but instead of heading for the door, he stepped closer, closing the gap she had tried to create. Lauren instinctively stepped back. "You don't understand," he whispered, almost breaking. "You're perfect." Lauren's spine tingled as she realized that he was the only one in this home who truly cared about her. She was afraid of what he would do if she turned away from him. "Ethan, stop this now," she said, her voice hardening. But before she could say anything more, Ethan turned and left, leaving Lauren standing there shaking in the dark with the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. The silence that followed felt even heavier, and Lauren took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her pulse was still racing, and she was unable to comprehend what had just happened. Why was there an undertone in Ethan's statements? And why had he been there? Of something so haunting that night, she didn't sleep a wink. Lauren knew this wasn't something she could brush aside. And she also knew from the look in Ethan's eyes tonight that whatever this was, it was only the beginning. The next morning, pale sunlight filtered through the curtain, but the house still felt cloaked in a heavy darkness. Lauren couldn't stop replaying the events of the previous night in her mind. Ethan had always acted strangely since moving in, but last night was something entirely different. He was no longer the shy, reserved young man she thought she knew. There was something in his eyes, an obsession she couldn't quite name, that unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. She thought back to the first morning. Ethan had moved in. Michael had told her that Ethan needed a place to get his life back together. But Lauren had sensed there was more to it. When she pressed Michael for details, he had brushed it off with a terse explanation. The boy had it rough since his mother left. "I think he needs a real family." Lauren, with her natural compassion, had agreed without hesitation. But now, looking back, she realized how little she truly knew about Ethan's past. It was as though Michael had deliberately kept certain details hidden, as if there were things he didn't want her to uncover. Her curiosity gwed at her refusing to be ignored. After breakfast, once Em had left for work, Lauren decided to confront Ethan directly. Found him in the living room, his gaze fixed on the television screen. Though it was clear he wasn't paying attention to anything on it, Lauren sat on the chair across from him, attempting to appear calm, though her voice betrayed a slight hesitation. "Ethan, can we talk for a moment?" He looked up, his piercing blue eyes catching the morning light but still holding that same distance quality. What about he? Ethan smirked. But it was a hollow smile, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, and Lauren bit her lip carefully as he asked, his tone as dry and uninterested as usual. I just want to understand you a bit better, so we can feel more comfortable living together. She said. Michael remarked that you've gone through a lot with your mother. But Lauren wasn't ready to give up. I don't believe you need to. His tone of disinterest stung at her tolerance. Is that accurate? My mother, Ethan repeated, lowering his voice. She is not a mother. She's a nightmare. He looked down at his hands, which were clenched into fists, and said, She didn't care about me. She only cared about the men she brought home. That question made him pause, as though stepping onto thin ice. And then he sat up straighter, as if the mention of his mother had touched a raw nerve. When she asked, her voice softening as if she were negotiating a minefield. Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound short and sharp. Your father abandoned me a long time ago. He only cared about his work when my mother left. He didn't come back for me. She hadn't expected him to open up so quickly or so bitterly. But there was no denying the venom in his tone. I had to learn how to survive on my own. Lauren was speechless. Ethan's voice was roiling with pain. But there was also something disturbing about the way he looked at her. His eyes lingered on her face for longer than necessary, which made her feel more and more uncomfortable. Then why did you agree to move here? Lauren's throat went dry as she tried to respond to deny it. But his gaze seemed to peel away every layer of her thoughts, leaving her exposed. There was something wrong with the way he said those words, as though he was placing her in a role she had never agreed to. I thought I'd be okay as long as you were here, Ethan asked, trying to change the direction of the conversation. But his eyes snapped back to hers sharper now. Colder because of you. The only reason I returned was because of you. Lauren stood up quickly, and the room's air became too heavy to breathe. I believe we should stop talking now. If you need anything, please talk to me. Or Michael. Ethan didn't say anything more. He simply watched her, his eyes following her every movement as she left the room. Lauren walked away with the distinct feeling that she was fleeing rather than simply leaving. And as much as she wanted to believe that this was over, deep down she knew the truth. It was only the beginning. That night the house was utterly silent. Yet Lauren couldn't sleep. Ethan's words from earlier that morning echoed relentlessly in her mind. You're the only reason I came back. The statement felt like a confession, a declaration, and a warning all at once. She couldn't shake the image of his eyes, a mix of longing and pain piercing through her every thought. She had tried to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew it had crossed the line. Michael was working another late shift at the hospital, leaving her alone with Ethan once again. She tried not to dwell on it, reassuring herself that nothing would happen. Yet the uneasy knot in her stomach refused to go away. Lauren debated locking her bedroom door as she had done before, but hesitated. She didn't want to create an atmosphere of distrust, didn't want to acknowledge that she felt afraid. Ethan, after all, he was just a troubled young man, and she more than anyone understood what it felt like to be abandoned and starved of love near midnight. Lauren slipped quietly into the kitchen to get a glass of water, hoping to calm her swirling thoughts. As she returned to the living room, she froze, startled to see Ethan sitting on the sofa in the dim glow of the table lamp. He wasn't watching TV, nor was he on his phone. Unmoving, he just sat there looking into the blank space before him. Ethan, Lauren whispered out to him in a quiet, timid voice. What are you? I couldn't sleep, he continued, his voice firm and low, as he glanced up, his deep, expressive eyes meeting hers. Lauren, how about you? The room's air becomes suffocatingly thicker. I guess. Ethan got up slowly, his motions methodical, and he went toward her. The weak light from the lamp projected his shadow long over the floor, making him look almost spectral. Is it because of me? Neither could I, she said, attempting to keep her voice even more on my thoughts, with a tone that wavered between challenge and apologies. He asked. Lauren froze, her heart thumping so loudly that she worried he could hear. You're lying. His voice wasn't loud, but it had an eerie tone. You're afraid of me, aren't you? He said. I'm just tired, she said, her eyes darting away from his intense gaze. Ethan stopped a foot away, near enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. Lauren opened her mouth to reply, but the words stuck in her throat, immobilizing her. Ethan leaned in slightly, his eyes examining her face, examining every detail as if attempting to commit her to memory. "I don't want to scare you," he whispered, his voice soft and almost tender. "I just can't stop thinking about you." Lauren instinctively took a step back, but Ethan mirrored her movement, closing the gap once more. "Ethan stopped," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't do this." But he didn't stop. Instead, he reached out his fingers, lightly brushing her arm in a gesture that was both gentle and deeply unsettling. "Ethan, I'm not who you think I am." Lauren retreated even further, but she felt the cold, unforgiving wall on her back. She had nowhere else to go. "You are the only person in this home who genuinely cares about me. I'm Michael's wife, your stepmother. We can't, but you're not like the others." Ethan interrupted, his eyes blazing with desperation. "You're everything I've ever wanted. You're the only one who makes me feel like I matter." Lauren felt panic rising in her chest, but at the same time, she sensed something else, an inexplicable pull, a magnetic force that held her captive in his gaze. The raw vulnerability in his voice, the unmistakable pain in his words reached into some deep hidden corner of her heart. It was in that moment she realized things were slipping, sapping dangerously out of control. The tension in the room was suffocating. And though her mind screamed at her to put an end to this, there was a part of her that was drawn to the intensity of Ethan's gaze. She shoved him away harder than she thought she could and bolted for her bedroom, slamming the door behind her and locking it tightly. Her chest heaved with each breath, her heart pounding erratically. She knew she had narrowly avoided crossing a boundary, and that terrified her even more than Ethan's actions. But the most frightening thing of all, wasn't it Ethan? The question that was nagging at the back of her mind was what she had done and whether this was really the end of it. Lauren. It was the hazy, unshakable sensation that was rising within her. She sat up in bed, her back against the headboard, her eyes focused on the securely locked door. The faint shadows cast by the bedside lamp made the room feel more sinister than it had ever been before. Despite her best efforts, the image of Ethan, his frantic eyes and his trembling, longing voice kept returning, vivid and unavoidable, as if he were still standing just beyond the door. A gentle knock broke the oppressive silence, and Lauren froze, her breath caught in her throat. The voice was deep, quiet, and painfully familiar. It was Ethan. "Go away, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to remain calm. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. The knock wasn't loud, but it was persistent, as if whoever was outside knew she was there and had no intention of leaving Lauren. "I don't want to talk to you. You can't keep hiding like this." His voice remained gentle, but there was something unnervingly resolute in the way he spoke. "I just want to talk. I promise there's nothing for us to talk about," she snapped, raising her voice in the hope it would push him to leave. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that easy. Sure enough, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more forceful, as if Ethan wanted to make it clear that he wasn't going anywhere. "Ethan, if you don't leave, I'll call Michael right now," Lauren yelled, the panic rising in her voice. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone. But instead of retreating, Ethan let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Michael," he said, his voice suddenly darker, tinged with anger and pain. "He doesn't care about you, Lauren. He only cares about his work. Do you really think he'll come running to save you? He doesn't even notice how lonely you are." Lauren's hands trembled as she gripped her phone, ready to dial Michael's number. But she hesitated. A part of her, one she didn't want to acknowledge, knew Ethan wasn't entirely wrong. Michael was always busy, always leaving her alone in this large, silent house. But that didn't mean she would let Ethan push the boundaries further. The sound of the doorknob rattling sent a wave of icy fear through her. Ethan was trying to open the door. "Don't," she screamed, her voice cracking with fear and rage. "Ethan, if you don't stop right now, I'll call the police." The rattling stopped, and she held her breath, straining to hear any sound. until she finally heard the faint sound of slow, deliberate footsteps retreating down the hallway. She wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or stay on high alert. But before she could gather her thoughts, a loud crash echoed from downstairs, the sound of breaking glass followed by heavy, deliberate footsteps. Lauren jumped out of bed, her heart thumping so hard she thought it might burst. She knew Ethan hadn't left, but he had found another, far more dangerous and insane way back. She gripped her phone and dialed Michael's number, but no one answered. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to defend herself. She opened her closet and discovered the baseball bat Michael kept for emergencies. Holding it tightly in her hands, she felt a slight surge of control return to her body as she cautiously entered the hallway, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Ethan's footsteps thudding beneath her, his voice low and almost melodic but chillingly unhinged. "Did you really think you could hide forever, Lauren? I know you feel the same way I do. Stop pretending." Lauren tightened her grip on the bat, her palms slick with perspiration, and she went down the stairs one step at a time, her eyes fixed on Ethan's figure in the dimly lit living room. He was standing with his back to her, a bottle of wine in one hand, its contents drained, and his eyes locked on the framed wedding photo of Lauren and Michael Ethan on the wall in front of him. Her voice was as steady as she could get it. "Could you handle it? You must go now." Ethan turned slowly to her, his eyes shining with a wild intensity she had never seen before. He then echoed a twisted smile that was frigid and frightening rather than friendly or kind. Lauren's grip on the baseball bat tightened her knuckles, making them white as if they were the only thing keeping her sane. Ethan took a deliberate step toward her, but she recognized the look in his eyes, not that of a wounded, misunderstood boy, but that of someone who had completely unraveled and lost all control. The air in the room seemed to thicken, weighing her down with an oppressive tension. "Don't do this," Lauren said, her voice trembling but laced with as much resolve as she could muster. "Michael will be home any minute." Ethan laughed in a way that sent shivers down Lauren's spine. "Every statement seems like a vice tightening, Lauren. Yet he's never here and doesn't even notice how you feel around her." But Lauren knew she couldn't keep retreating. If she didn't act now, things would spiral completely out of control. "Ethan, listen to me," she said, forcing her voice to stay calm but firm. "You're hurting both of us. By doing this, I want to help you, but not like this." For a fleeting moment, Ethan faltered, his eyes flickering with something. Regret perhaps, or hesitation, but the wildness that had consumed. He returned almost immediately, dark and unrelenting. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "You don't understand. I don't need your help. I just need you." Lauren felt fear coil tightly in her chest, threatening to paralyze her. But she wouldn't let it. "You need to stop this now, Ethan," she said, her voice rising with renewed strength. "If you take one more steps, I'll call the police. I swear I will." Ethan froze, his body taut with tension. For one agonizing moment his gaze softened, and she saw a glimpse of the boy he used to be, was lost and broken, searching for something he couldn't find. But then, as if a switch flipped, his fists clenched and his eyes hardened with defiance. "You won't," he said, his voice a low challenge. At that very moment, the sound of the front door opening cut through the suffocating silence, followed by Michael's voice calling out, "Lauren, where are you?" "Relieved?" Lauren felt the wave pass quickly, but she understood that the issue was far from over and may potentially become worse. "He doesn't belong here," Ethan growled, his voice rising. "He abandoned me. He doesn't deserve you," he said. Seizing the opportunity while Ethan was distracted, Lauren ran toward the door. "Michael, watch out," she shouted as she reached the living room entrance. Michael stepped inside, his face etched with confusion as he took in the scene. Lauren holding a baseball bat, Ethan approaching him with wild, purposeful strides before Ethan could get any closer. "Watch out," she said as she arrived at the door. Michael swiftly moved to Lauren's side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder while his eyes remained fixed on Ethan. "What the hell is going on here?" Lauren swung the bat hard, slamming it down onto the coffee table between them. The loud crack of wood splintering echoed through the room, stopping Ethan in his tracks. He stood there trembling, His energy drained as though the sound had jolted him back to reality. His shoulders slumped, and his gaze fell to the floor. Defeated, Michael demanded his voice be a mixture of anger and alarm, still catching her breath. Lauren looked directly at Ethan. "He needs help," she said, her voice quivering but resolute. "We can't let this go on." Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were wet, but the tears weren't from remorse, they were from the crushing realization that everything he's tried to build, misguided attempt to get closer to Lauren, had crumbled. Without a word, he turned and stepped back, his lips moving soundlessly until he finally muttered, "I'm sorry," for rushing out the door into the night. Michael made a move to follow, but Lauren stopped him with her hand gripping his arm. "Let him go," she said, her voice weary but firm. "He needs time. And we need to talk." That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, Lauren and Michael sat down together and talked about everything, about the distance that had grown between them, about Michael's absence, and about the pain Ethan had carried with him for so long. Michael agreed that Ethan needed professional help, and they resolved to find a program that could help him heal once he was ready to return. Lauren knew this wasn't the end. Ethan was still part of their family, and what had happened wouldn't be forgotten easily. But she also knew this was the first step toward repairing the cracks, not just in their family, but within herself. As she gazed out the window at the empty moonlit street, one thought lingered in her mind. She hoped Ethan would find his way, no matter how long it took.